In our last session, we explored this idea of creating different colours using L.S. Lowry's work as our stimulus. And we're going to be applying that to doing some actual painting in this session, where we're going to try and answer the question of what is perspective. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be exploring how a painting is created in different layers and about how we can actually create those. And we're going to start this session by looking at one of Lowry's paintings. We're going to be looking at the industrial landscape that L.S. Lowry painted in 1955. And I want us to think about some questions while we're looking at this. Which parts of this painting do you think are closest to you as a viewer? And how do you know that? What has L.S. Lowry done that makes you realise that these parts are closer than another part? In the same way, which parts of the painting are furthest away? And how do you know that? So thinking about those ones which are closest, how do you know they're not further away? What is the similarities and differences between these? Now we've looked at the parts closest to us and the parts furthest away. Do you know the words and the vocabulary that we would use to describe these parts of the painting? And finally, do you know what we call this effect in artwork? So we're going to go and have a look at our painting, Industrial Landscape, which was painted by Lowry in 1955. And I want you to think carefully about these questions so that you can get an idea of what we're looking at today and how we're going to apply that colour mixing, the tones, the tints, the shades that we did last session into our paintings this. So when you're looking at this, be thinking, which parts of this painting are closest to you? And how do you know they're closest? What's different about those bits really close to you than other parts? So when you're looking at the parts that are furthest away, how do you know they are further away? You'll find a copy of this on the website so you can have a little look at it and take your time to investigate those 4 questions we've just been asking. So if you think about the painting that you've just been looking at, we're looking at the parts which are closest to us. Those parts in this painting, they're clearer to you as you look at them. The colours that Lowry uses are brighter. There's more detail to them. When we look at those bits of the painting that are further away, because they become fainter, you can almost just about see the outline. It's like they're shrouded in mist, where the details are less notable. The colours are far subtler. What would we call these parts of paintings? Well, we're going to look at these in a little bit, the names of them. But this is called perspective, and it's that way that when you look at something, when it's close up to you, it's nice and big and detailed, and you can take it all in. As it moves further away, it becomes smaller, it becomes less distinct, it becomes less detailed, harder to see, harder to notice. And that's what L.S. Lowry's been doing in his paintings, and exactly what we're going to be doing in our own today. Now, Lowry painted many landscape paintings, and in many of them, he uses perspective to make things seem nearer or further away in his paintings. To help him do this, Lowry tried to break up his paintings into 3 sections. He had a foreground, a midground, and a background. Now, looking at this painting, can you spot where these different parts are? Can you spot where the foreground is? Can you spot where the midground is? And can you spot where the background is? Thinking about what we've already looked at in our idea of perspective and thinking about what those words could mean. Pause the video, have a little think about those 3 areas and see whether you can identify them. So you can see I've shaded some of the screen out now. So the bit which isn't shaded, this is the foreground, and it usually takes up about the bottom third of the painting. So if you had your canvas or your piece of paper, you chop it into 3 equal parts. We're looking at the bottom part of it. And the objects in this section are usually going to be more vivid, darker colours and be larger in size. They're probably going to have slightly more detail involved in them. So this part that you can see now is the foreground. The midground, which is what you can see now, will usually take up the middle third of the painting. And the objects in this section are going to be a little bit lighter than those in the foreground, maybe slightly smaller, and are probably slightly less detailed. So if you look very carefully, can you see how these figures are different in the foreground than the midground? Have a little pause for the video and have a look and see whether you can notice those differences in this painting. And our final section is the background. This takes up around the top third of the painting. The objects in this section are going to be lighter in tone than the rest of the painting. They're going to be smaller, they're going to be less detailed because they're farther away. Now on the website you'll find these images on one of the links, and if you go to them you can have a little explore. You can see whether you can identify those different parts that Lowry uses to help break up his paintings and help him with those perspectives. So have a little explore on that website, have a look at the house on the moor, Huddersfield, the pond, Lancashire Fair. See whether he always uses this idea of foreground, midground and background. Do they always take up 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or does he play around with them? And how can you spot where that difference begins? Now, this isn't going to be a straight line drawn on a painting. It's going to blur into it, so it's not always going to be exact, and you're going to have some little bits that will bleed into the other parts. But you're looking at that idea of the thirds to give you that idea of the foreground, midground and background. So pause the video, have a little explore, come and join me when you're ready to share your findings. So on this image, hopefully you're going to be able to see this idea of those three distinct layers. If we look, the effect of objects getting lighter as they move into the background is called atmospheric perspective. And we can actually replicate this in our paintings using those lighter tones and tints of the colours that we looked at in the last session. So if we look at this picture, for example, you can notice there's sort of that bright green of the trees that you can just see the top of. Right in front of you, that very first hill towards the right, again it's a darker colour. Then you've got the middle section of those 2-3 hills on the left hand side, but are fainter still. And then you go further back where it's almost becoming like a grey, it almost blends in with the sky, it's so light. And that's your next part. So we've got our foreground, those really bright vibrant greens, our midground, that's slightly subdued green colours, and then moving towards the very far background, we're looking at that sort of greyish tint to the colours. Here's a city landscape to make the same point. We can see how, as we move further back, the colour becomes less crisp, the detail becomes less, the size becomes smaller, and the objects get smaller and less detailed as you move away. So think about those paintings you looked at. Did you spot those in L.S. Lowry's paintings? Because now what we're going to be looking at is creating our very own landscape. Now for this activity, it would be best to have some paint, but if you had some crayons or colouring pencils, you can sort of do a similar technique as we're going to be looking at. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating our own landscapes using the idea of that atmospheric perspective. This is where our objects are going to get smaller, less detailed and lighter as they move backwards. And we're going to be using 1936, A Landmark by L.S. Lowry, as our inspiration for this. So as you can see, we're just going to really use the same one colour, but we're going to be creating different tints and tones based on that. In this instance, we can see that he's been using grey. Now we're going to start right at the back. We're going to start with our background. And when painting a landscape, this is probably the best place to start. And you're going to start with the lightest colour. That means when you paint over it with different things, it's going to be easier to paint over and not to see it standing out. And also what it means is you're going to be covering most of the page. You're going to paint this part in the top third, but you're going to actually bring down your colour to try and cover the rest of the page as well. Because this background doesn't just stop in the top third, it's going to carry on and it's just simply going to go behind things. So your first step is create your background. Just as you can see, this is a nice hill with our train bridge, our aqueduct going through. So maybe look out of your window to see what you can see, or maybe an image you're going to create from your own mind. The next thing is going to be our midground, and this is going to be with a darker colour to paint the midground. Remember, we're doing that atmospheric perspective where they get things slightly bigger, slightly more detailed, slightly darker. And we're focusing on the idea of darker. So your midground is going to cover some of the background you've already painted. It's going to overlap it, and then you're going to drop it down to the bottom of the page again, the same as you did with your background. And for our last bit, you're going to be looking at your foreground. Now think about that atmospheric perspective. We've got darker as we've come closer. So now this is the darker, more vivid colours. And this layer, again, is going to cover the paintings that you've already created. The foreground objects can be painted as if they're coming off the page to make it look like they're really close. So this is the one where you might have slightly more detail. But notice on mine, I haven't worried about things that are in. I'm just doing different shapes. You can see how we can see the very pale grey at the back. Then we've got the slightly mid grey, and then we've got the darker grey to actually create our painting. And in Lowry's painting of the landmark, you can see he's followed a similar idea. Fainter at the back, getting darker as he moves forward. So can you point out the background, foreground and midground on this painting? How would you describe it? And Lowry has actually done something slightly different. Why do you think Lowry has painted the furthest hill as the darkest? So he's actually played around with this idea of getting darker the closer you can, because everything else seems like it follows that, except that one hill. What effect does this have on the audience? Have a little pause, have a little think. Once you're happy and you think you're ready, then I want you to go and create your own landscape picture. Remember, this could be something you know, something you can see, something that you're just going to make up. But don't worry about the details of your drawing buildings. Don't worry about the brickwork and the windows and things. Just get that shape, starting with your lightest tone at the back, your mid-tone for your midground, and then your darkest tone for your foreground. Think about what colours you want. It's entirely up to you, your imagination. So good luck, and I really look forward to seeing your atmospheric perspective LS Lowry paintings.